Hello, and welcome to episode number 2 of the Life by Guitar podcast by yours truly, Chadwick Becks. And today we're going to be talking about preparing to learn a piece for guitar. If you would like to support the podcast, you can always support us by going to anchor.fm/lifebyguitar, and you can see ways to support us there. But you can also really support us by sharing and liking and all those things. That actually helps the most. So let's get right into it. All right, so the repertoire for the guitar is endless, as most of you know. Most guitarists, including professionals, give little thought to the process of learning a piece of music. But if frustration and slow progress are to be lessened, then there needs to be an understanding of how to prepare to learn a piece of music. My first ideas of this kind began as I learned about the process of teaching children through the Suzuki method. Let me get this out of the way. As a method, I do not think it's good or bad. It all depends on the one instructing. I'll possibly leave my comments about this methodology in a later podcast, but that's all for now. One of the elements that the books do well is to give preparatory exercises a few pages before the piece, the skill that requires it begins. One day it dawned on me that I never really looked at pieces this way. Sure, I've worked on techniques like scales, arpeggios, and tremolo, but to look into a piece prior to learning it and asking what skills are necessary before actually beginning the piece was not a part of my thinking. This goes for classical pieces, jazz solos, rock solos, acoustic fingerstyle, well, just anything you want to learn on the guitar. I've always done this type of thinking when it comes to teaching a strumming song. Find out what the chords for the song are, teach the student to play the chords accurately, and then change quickly enough and give them a song to learn. It makes sense, right? But after the basics are learned, then I wouldn't continue down this path. It's as if I thought that all skills could be learned now from the pieces themselves. As I have learned, this is a notable fallacy. To my knowledge, the best expository of this fallacy is found in Christopher Berg's book, Practicing Music by Design, Historic Virtuosi on Peak Performance. To be completely transparent, I've been a student of Christopher, and he has had a great impact on my playing and teaching. However, I've questioned many of his teachings on my own. I remember one lesson asking about different techniques used in various source material books that he used for his book. He looked up in surprise and said, "Chad, in all my teaching, I don't know if any of my students have actually read the source material from which I used in my research." After leaving the lesson, I took it as a compliment, but during the lesson, I thought it was the norm for scholarly work and found it odd that he had made such a statement. His argument on what he calls the technique from pieces fallacy goes against the prevailing idea that you can learn all the techniques necessary for playing the guitar by learning pieces. I will not go into restating Christopher's argument. If you're interested, then reading his book is the best place to stretch your understanding of this particular point. As far as it concerns the topic of the subject at hand, I quote this: "The student wasn't ready for the piece to be interpreted because the student's energy and brain power were appropriated by the mechanics of getting the piece played. And also, as one assimilates and acquires a skill, brain activity decreases, leaving energy for approaching higher levels of skill or adding more skills." I'll attempt to put the above statements in context for our subject of preparing to learn a piece. When learning a piece of music, we're presented with multiple problems that need to be solved. And this is secondary to the technique needed to solve them. If the technique is not already present, then all of our energy will be expended on trying to learn the technique rather than solving the musical problems contained in the piece. Or, all our energy will be put into trying to make the music sound appropriately, and we think our technique will somehow arrive as we find the notes. But as Christopher explains, this is not how the great virtuosi have and do approach these issues. Most of those of you listening to this podcast will not be concerned with becoming virtuosi. But the idea I'm considering is that we need to think more critically as teachers and students about the inherent technical challenges that are presented in the piece or song before beginning to put our energy into actually learning the song. This should be a given and has different ramifications for those that are professionals, college students working towards a performance degree, and or aspiring professionals. I understand that this forethought might be difficult for the beginning or intermediate guitarist, which is most of those listening to this podcast. How, as a beginner, are you supposed to know the skills you need before you need them? That's where the aid of a teacher is worth the cost. But if having a teacher is out of the question for whatever reason, then you're going to need to be extra critical in examining the songs you want to put your work into before you begin. The following is a rough understanding of how to begin deciphering the skills needed for any piece you're attempting to learn. I'll do my best to cover the large variety of learning that I teach, from chord songs to tablature playing to notational playing. Obviously, I cannot cover every style of music in every situation. This is made even more difficult by the differences between pick and fingerstyle playing. Also, I'm not taking into account the current bass level a player might already have before beginning a piece. These questions are meant to help guide you at whatever stage you currently find yourself with whatever style you currently play. I mean, really, I could probably write a book about each one. All right, so let's jump right into chords and strumming evaluation. Let's begin with the simplest evaluation, chords and strumming. Most beginning guitarists start their journey here. It's a rough and tumbles thing to begin the guitar with chords. Before I ever have a student begin chords, we learn to pick individual notes to coordinate the right and left hands. Then we add double notes and finally chords. This is taking into account that the student's goals are focused on this type of playing. When chords are finally reached and songs are within reach, the below evaluation can begin. First, look over all the chords in the song. Most pop songs are going to have a very limited variety of chords and chord shapes. Do you know all the chords in the song? Have you played them before? Are there any bar chords? Are there more chords that you don't recognize than ones that you do? Do they require shifting up the neck? Second, make a list of all the chords used. Notice how many are new and how many are familiar. If you have a song with more than 20% new chords that are not the same shape, then I'd suggest picking a different piece. Otherwise, notice if the chords require large hand movements or shifting up the neck in the song's progression. Third, figure out the tempo of the song. This doesn't need to be scientific. Just tap your foot and find out how fast the chords are being transitioned between. Then, attempt to play the chords you already know at that tempo. If you can play all of them at tempo, great. Otherwise, you know you need to work on them. The chords you don't know need to be practiced and eventually played at tempo. I remind everyone working on chords that the most important element is to play the chord on the beat that it changes. The strum pattern does not mean a thing if you cannot change it on time. Imagine accompanying the song Happy Birthday at a party. You strum the first measure with an awesome rhythm, and then everyone has to wait for you to grab the next chord. That's not a pretty sight. If you just play one strum for every measure, then everyone can sing along, and you hit every chord where it's supposed to be. Finally, after the chord changes can be played in sequence on time, then move on to working out the strumming. I won't go into how to do that here. This is about evaluating a piece to help in preparing to learn a piece or song. Next up, tablature evaluation. Tablature evaluations are a bit more difficult, but follow similar rules given before. The two problems most prevalent with tablature are the medium's lack of indicating rhythm and fingerings. The former is remedied when the notation is included with the tablature. This latter is usually absent. Also, most online resources for tablature have neither the rhythm nor fingerings included. This makes evaluation even more difficult. When moving to tablature notation, the guitarist is more than likely advancing in their chord strumming skills and seeking to add a riff, more intricate chord playing, or possibly a single note guitar solo. Without a teacher, this can be difficult to evaluate, but let's try. First, listen to the piece you're attempting to play. Notice the use of guitars throughout. Are you interested in just the main riffs, rhythm guitar, i.e., or are you interested in soloing and fill work? And it's usually single note solos and things like that. Second, if your interest lies in the rhythm, then follow the previous steps for the chord strumming evaluation for songs that contain mostly block style chords, those that don't have a specific riff. For riff style, play through each riff without any tempo or rhythm and evaluate the hand movements. Are there any that seem out of the ordinary? Use large stretches or big shifts up and down the neck. Have you seen any of these shapes and movements before? This will make learning easier. Then, tap out the tempo as previously described in the chord strumming evaluation. This is where you'll need to make an educated guess based on your ability on whether it is within reach to play it. At this point, You might begin to isolate specific types of movements. One might be power chord shifting or double notes with string crossing. There are endless factors that may be considered. That's what makes learning from tablature and on your own very difficult. Third, if you find soloing where you want to go, then you need to figure out the key and scales. This could mean you put the solo aside for a while until you build up the necessary speed in your scale forms. Also, notice any technical challenges like bending, sweep picking, harmonics, tremolo picking, etc. If any of these are not up to the tempo of the song, then you need to practice them away from the music before returning to the work on the piece. This evaluation using tablature may sound like an advertisement for studying with a teacher. Well, in a way, it is. After 20 years of teaching, the lack of identifying what needs to be mastered to learn a piece causes much frustration in students. Many times, it leads them to quit and/or constantly struggle. A set of eyes on what you need to learn and the ability to formulate a path to learn it cuts the learning curve greatly. All right, let's move on to classical notation evaluation. Tablature evaluation is very difficult for a beginner or intermediate guitarist. However, due to the nature of notational standards in classical music, evaluating for classical/fingerstyle guitar is actually more clear-cut. First, look at the rhythm and tempo of the piece. Is the time signature unusual? Are there any measures or phrases that look unusually complicated from a rhythm perspective? Can you figure out these passages rhythmically in a short amount of time? When considering the tempo, are there any passages that look like they would be difficult when played up to tempo? Second, look through the piece for tonal issues. What key is the piece in? Are you used to playing in it? Are there any areas with a lot of accidentals? Do you notice string numbers or Roman numerals indicating notes played on different locations on the fingerboard? Third, check for any left-hand challenges. Are fingerings written in, or are you going to need to spend time figuring all of them out? Do you notice many bar chords, stretches, or fast scalar passages? Are there any special techniques indicated like artificial harmonics, slurs, trills, etc.? Fourth, check for right-hand challenges. Is the piece mostly arpeggio or tremolo? Are there scales that require string crossing and alternation? Does it move from one musical texture to another, i.e. homophony to polyphony, etc.? Are special right-hand indications given like ponticello, sul tasto, etc.? Are there any specialized right-hand techniques including raschiato, artificial harmonics, etc.? Fifth, play through the piece as best you can to identify anything you might think will give you trouble. You'll miss something, so don't worry. If you find later that you need to step away from the piece to learn a new skill before returning, that's fine. If you cannot make it through the piece in one short reading, then I'm going to suggest it is too difficult for you to begin with. You should find another piece to work up to first. That being stated, if you want to eventually play this piece, then there's nothing wrong in making note of the technical challenges that need to be worked on to build up to playing the piece. Finally, write down everything you've identified and put it to the test. If you identified a certain arpeggio, then can you play the arpeggio using standard chords at the desired tempo for the piece? If you identified scalar passages, then do you know the scale it comes from, and can you play it at tempo? Are there a number of bar chords, other chords, or different stretches you are unfamiliar with? What are their names, and can you land them at the tempo required for the piece? Through this type of questioning, you can begin to understand the technical requirements needed and evaluate whether you can meet those requirements now or need to wait to begin the piece after you have done the preparatory work to reach those requirements. Again, it's impossible for me to write down everything to check for when evaluating a piece to consider preparing to learn. I hope you get a general idea and that there is much to consider as a student's skill level increases. All right, let's talk about jazz and other evaluations. Jazz has its feet in a number of evaluations above. It uses notation to identify the head or melody. It focuses on chord changes to develop comping and soloing. An understanding of scales and arpeggios is paramount to good improvisation. So due to this mixed nature, I'll leave this evaluation as a combination of the aforementioned material. I might come back to it in a different podcast. All right, let's try to sum this up. That's a lot to think about. I wish I could just say, find a teacher and your troubles would be solved. However, many teachers don't look at learning pieces this way, or they do in some areas and not in others. I know I have been incomplete in my own approach many times to songs with my students and the ones that they are working on. No teacher is perfect, and neither am I. but hopefully I can learn from teaching failures in the past and keep putting my best foot forward. As you begin to think about learning a new piece or song, I hope you consider taking a step back to look at what needs to be mastered in order to play it successfully. This may mean working on exercises and skills before ever playing a single note of the actual piece. If you take this approach, then I'm confident you'll find your progress moves quicker and you're building a base that follows you and grows from piece to piece. All right, so that is the end of this episode, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope I didn't talk too fast in this one. And please give me some feedback if you don't mind. It would be great. And let me know how you think this material works in your own guitar playing. Again, if you want to support what we're doing or what I'm doing, you can go to anchor.fm/lifebyguitar and see the podcast there. So until next time, happy practicing.